Building an MVP is one of my go-to strategies, especially when I'm working with a client that doesn't fully know what's in their database and what kind of data can be reported on. Or we want to try and figure out what's the best value we can get from our data in a fast way. This is a strategy we used to use when I worked at IBM, and I've also built MVPs at other places that are both smaller in size as well as large financial institutions. Hey friends, my name is Hamza. I am a data strategy and analytics consultant. Building an MVP essentially comes down to 4 steps. So when we're building a business intelligence solution, there's going to be a lot of noise. We're also going to have a lot of data. There are all these competing business priorities. So we have to figure out how we're going to focus on the most impactful business question. What are those things that's going to drive the business forward? So we have to get super narrow focused. And that might start with like 10 different business questions that we want answered. But we have to figure out how we're going to focus on that. We want to take those questions and then we also want to make it so it's actionable at the end. So we can answer the so what. This way, we're just not going to be looking at our data. We can turn that data into information and do something with that information. The next thing we have to do is we got to go get the data. And I've been on both sides of the coin where sometimes some companies have so much data and they don't know how to make sense of it or where to start. And then on the other hand, there are companies who have all these questions, but they don't fully know where that data is or how to get that data. I personally like to build a prototype before I build my MVP. This way we can figure out what kind of data we have and what data we might still need to get before we can build this MVP, and is it even worth starting a whole project. So now for the prototype, you can get some sample data from spreadsheets, APIs, and any of the source systems that might have that data. At this point, we want to see what that question was that we defined in the previous step, and then start using that data to figure out how we can answer those questions with calculations. And if we need to transform the data, you want to go ahead and transform that data now and start putting it into your prototype. And that could be anything like Excel or Google Sheets. Figure out some of your key summary points and key visualizations that helps answer that question. And then finally take that data that you've transformed and did additional calculations and summary on top of, put that into your reports in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever tool you're using. Now we're going to go ahead and move to the prototype stage. In the prototype stage, we want to start assembling that dashboard feel that we want to have. You might have high-level summary reports and detailed reports underneath that to answer a business question. So start putting your prototype together. We're not going to be spending a lot of resources here, so that's why we're not investing any tools at this moment. We're just trying to use the tools we have on hand and figure out if we can answer the business question with the data we have on hand. So we're trying to validate our approach here. During this validation phase, we're also figuring out if the data that we did the calculations and transformation on answered those questions and if it's meeting those business needs. If it's not, we need to go back to our data sources and figure out, do we have all the data that we need? Do we need to work with any additional stakeholders to get the additional data? And how can we refine our system to make sure we get everything we need for this prototype? Now, before we go into building an MVP, I like to take my prototype and work with my stakeholders. So that might be the business owner, the executives, whoever is going to be using this data to make those informed decisions. I like to work with them and make sure that it's going to answer their needs. At this point, we should have figured out where our data sources are coming from. That's already been identified because of the prototype, what kind of calculations we need to put in place, and that's been figured out, and what kind of visualizations we want to have, and also what level of summary we want to have. So we have all this stuff figured out, and that prototype works really well for our requirements. Now we're ready to dive a little bit more technical into how we're going to be building the solution. And what kind of tools you end up using to build this will vary based on what kind of technical skill sets you have and what kind of budget your company has. So at this stage, we'll connect our data sources to our business intelligence tool. We'll bring in the data and we'll start working with the core functionality. So I like to just at this point take what I've built in the prototype and replicate this into my business intelligence tool. So an example of this might be that you might have built your prototype in Excel. What I've used in the past has been Excel with Power Query and Power Pivot. So I've built my dashboard in there. And now when it's time to build it into this business intelligence tool, I'm just going to be replicating what I've already built in another tool in a much faster way. So now I know exactly what I need to build, and I'll start building that into the tool, and I'll focus on the functionality that the users might need, which might be the different types of views that they might want, the different way the data needs to be displayed, but also what kind of filters I want to put in place, what kind of sorting I need to put in place if it is tabular data. Do I need to have an export feature? And what kind of access controls I need to put in place to make sure that the data only stays within the team and the users that should have access to it. And this is where one of the key differences between a prototype and a proper business intelligence tool is going to come into play, because a prototype is not going to be scalable. You can't really refresh the data easily in it. Things are going to break, the transformations are going to break, it could be very, very slow. So this is when we need to make sure we pick a tool that is scalable with our data volume and the visualizations and the analysis that we're going to be needing. And remember, one of the core ideas behind an MVP is to get that feedback as fast as possible while actually delivering business value upfront. Really good business reports developers and designers are going to be able to build you a beautiful MVP that can actually drive value. And this is one of the key differences between prototyping and building an MVP, because in the MVP stage, we're ideally picking a tool we're going to be sticking with for the long term, where we're going to keep building on top of this. We're not going to be building a new dashboard every single time. We can add more to this reporting system. In order to do that, we have to have a certain type of mindset when we're building this. And let me talk about some of those things that I've learned over the years that's going to really help you take it from just a reporting tool for one-time use to a long-term strategy that you can start implementing in your business and having a solid data strategy that is going to be sustainable and help your business grow. Tip number one is start with the basic stuff, start with essentials. Do not overcomplicate it. Don't try to bring in all the data that's sitting out there for your organization. Only focus on the business question that will drive the most value. Tip number two is leverage using existing tools that you already have in place. Custom development works well for enterprise customers that have a lot of resources and a lot of technical teams that can do this kind of stuff. But even then, I've seen priorities change and resources get pulled off from one project onto a more higher priority project. So think carefully before you go into custom development. Tip number three is I like to prioritize my requirements, especially if I get the sense that the scope of this project is starting to expand. Then I like to bring the client back in and figure out, okay, let's prioritize our requirements. Let's identify whether it's a must-have, nice to have, or not needed, or a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale system. Whatever system works for you, use some way of identifying what's the highest priority kind of stuff that is important for your stakeholders and your needs. Tip number four is reduce points of failure. The more places you bring the data from and the more hops it has to go through to get to your final destination, the more likely something will fail along the lines. And if just one of those steps fail, then your entire dashboard just doesn't get refreshed until that one problem is solved. Or different components of it updated, but not all of it will be updated. So when you're designing your solution, try to make it as little steps as possible for the optimal results. Tip number five is think about sustainable systems. Build systems that will require minimum upkeep. The type of data integration tools you end up picking. Stick to essential data integration only. Bring only the data you need. Sometimes it is nice to house your data in some sort of a database all at once when you're first starting out. This way, when you're doing your iteration process, you can go back to that database and figure out what data you might need to pull in to make sure you get your MVP. But when it comes to putting it onto your dashboard, that's where I like to limit what I'm bringing in, because if you bring in too much, it's just going to increase the scope. It's going to increase the work you have to do for transformation and upkeep. It may also confuse the end user. So only bring in the data that you need. Tip number seven is automate cautiously. And this relates to building the entire MVP in the first place. While you're building your prototype, if you have not ironed out the data collection and transformation process, and if it can be automated, then you might not want to build this MVP yet until you figure all those steps out. And this also applies to once you do set up your MVP, then whenever your automations are running, just make sure there's some sort of a human involved who understands the data and understands the calculations to validate that kind of MVP, make sure that everything is automated properly, everything is working properly. Tip number 8 is use simple visualizations in the beginning and just focus on clarity. This happens especially when someone who's not so close to the data, but they're really more on the technical side, they start playing around with visualizations and see which one looks fun, which one is going to give us all this fancy trend lines with other stuff on it. And I think those things can be cool, especially if it answers your real business question. But avoid overcomplicating anything. Just start with simple visualizations and charts that's actually going to answer the question, and that's going to be catered to your audience. And try and balance the visualizations with the tabular data. It's easier to consume a lot of information with visualizations, but when you start having too many tables that has data and you might have to scroll to see all that data, that's better left for the detailed reports and the detailed analysis. Tip number 9 is with data collection and storage. And this is something you would have noticed in your prototype stage. If there is data that you need that you just don't have yet, then you'll have to evaluate how you're going to get that data for your data collection and if it's even feasible for this round. So in those cases, it might be better to evaluate if it's worth pursuing a different question for your business or how you're going to build that data collection process. And for your MVP, try to focus on simple transformations, only transform the things you need and store the data that you need into a good database. Especially if you don't have a tool yet and you're going to be picking a tool for your company, make sure that the tools that you do go with allow your database to grow and you have enough storage available on these tools. Or if you're able to hook up to an external database on the cloud that is cheaper storage, but also fast enough for some of this analytical capabilities. And finally, tip number 10, really important, but also kind of boring. The whole point of the MVP is to make sure we get good feedback and we know how to improve and do the next step and build on it in the future. So we want to make sure we have good documentation. We might need to make a data flow diagram. We should make a data architecture diagram, especially if there was a bunch of transformation and different data tables that we created. We should have good access controls in place and make sure that it's documented who should have access, who should not have access to this data and this MVP, and dashboards going forward in general. We should also monitor how our data is growing as this dashboard grows and our tables underneath the data storage, how that is going to be growing, because we might be replicating some of the data and storing and transformed data into the database. So we should keep an eye on that. We should have a process in place if things break. We should document how often our data will refresh and what happens if something doesn't refresh and what happens if it fails. And just focus on building good quality dashboards and business intelligence systems that's going to help your business grow. Building large-scale business intelligence systems can be overwhelming and it is kind of scary and there's a lot that can go wrong. So I do have a video on my channel where I talk about some of the most common mistakes and very costly mistakes that I've seen even at enterprise clients that cost them a lot of time and money. So I talk about how I handled those situations when I went in and I saw there was a lot that was going wrong and how to avoid those problems. So that's one video I highly recommend. For a lot of companies who are not ready to build an MVP yet, there's a lot of ways you can still automate your data and reporting. So I have another video where I talk about 4 different levels of automation that I've seen and I've put in place. And I will link that in the description below as well. Catch you in this next one.